It is my job to keep staff and students safe on this campus. Whenever I become too lax or start thinking nothing will happen here, I look at this clock tower and it reminds me of one of the most infamous mass killers of all times, Charles Whitman, the mass shooter of the University of Texas. On the morning of August 1st, 1966, Charles Whitman would walk into a nearby hardware store, purchase an M1 carbine, 8 boxes of ammo, and 2 magazines. Whitman would mention to the cashier that he planned to go hog hunting later that day. But what he really had planned would go down in history as one of America's most notorious mass shootings. Born June 24, 1941 in Lake Worth, Florida, Charles Whitman grew up learning about the outdoors and firearms. He was a scout as a kid and continued with scouting until he reached Eagle Scout. Whitman maintained good grades and seemed to be well adjusted. However, his home life was much darker. His family moved around a lot after Charles was born, and by the time he was 6, his family had already moved 8 times. Whitman's father was said to be verbally and physically abusive towards his wife and children. This abuse would plant seeds of hate in Charles's head towards his father. In an attempt to escape this abusive household, Charles would join the Marines right after his 18th birthday. Whitman thrived as a Marine and was considered to be a role model to many. He would go on to receive a scholarship from the Naval Enlisted Science Education Program, which he used to attend classes at the University of Texas. This is where Whitman would meet his future wife, Kathleen Lesner. Kathy would go on to graduate and become a teacher. On the other hand, Whitman would lose his scholarship due to failing grades and return to active duty with the Marines. It would be about this time that red flags began to pop up surrounding Whitman. He would find himself facing a court-martial for charges ranging from possession of a firearm and ammo to threatening the life of a fellow Marine. He would eventually take a guilty plea on all charges except the threat against the other Marine. Because of his excellent service record prior to this, for his crimes, Whitman would receive a reduction in rank and 30 days restriction. Just a slap on the wrist for the Marine. For a while, it would seem that Whitman had chosen to make a career of the military. But sometime in 1964, Whitman requested an early discharge, stating he wanted to return to the University of Texas to pursue a degree in agricultural engineering. His request was granted December of '64. He began classes in January of '65. Whitman's wife, Kathy, loved her husband and knew he loved her as well. But the pressure she was put under to be the perfect wife was overwhelming, and over time, that pressure only grew greater. His temper grew short and nasty. The smallest things would set him off. Kathy even confessed to 2 friends that Charles had hit her on 3 different occasions. Whitman could see that he was changing for the worse. He didn't like what he was becoming. It mirrored that hellish household he had grown up in. He had seen abuse firsthand and had even helped his mother escape his abusive father in May of '66. The thought of becoming the monster that his father was scared him. He wrote about this in his journal. But this was merely the shadow of the darkness that lay inside of Whitman's head. It became harder for Whitman to control his violent impulses. He would find himself full of rage for no reason at all. His journal had gone from positive daily affirmations to sick fantasies of death and plans of murder. Sources differ on how many times Whitman sought professional help, but they all agree that in March of '66, he kept an appointment at the University Health Center with a psychiatrist. He told the doctor about the abuse at home, his violent impulses, and that he was having severe headaches. At some point in his visit, he even mentioned that he was having fantasies about climbing to the top of the clock tower and shooting the people on the ground below. In the end, Whitman was told to go home. and if he continued to have these feelings, to schedule another appointment. These disturbing thoughts would continue to haunt Whitman. However, he would not set a follow-up appointment. Less than a month before Charles would commit those terrible acts of violence, Richard Speck would add his name to a short but growing list of spree killers. On the night of July 13th, 1966, and into the morning of July 14th, Speck would murder 8 nursing students by strangulation and stabbing them. Like Whitman, Speck had been a witness to and a victim of domestic violence. Speck's stepfather would verbally and physically abuse him and his siblings. His childhood trauma, rage, and mental health issues all came to a head on the night of July 13th. For 5 hours, Speck would torture 8 young women, even sexually assaulting at least one of them. For 2 days after the murders, Chicago would be held captive by fear. These killings would later be labeled the first random mass murder of the century. After his capture, he would be diagnosed as a sociopath. Speck would go on to deny any involvement in these brutal killings. A jury would find him guilty and sentence him to die. But that death sentence would be reversed, and he would be resentenced to 400 to 1,200 years in prison. In 1966, this was national news, and one has to wonder, had Charles Whitman followed this story? Had he seen a kindred spirit in Speck? Whatever the case, their stories will ever be linked due to their proximity in time. Just over 2 weeks from the date that Speck murdered 8 nursing students, Charles Whitman would sit down at his typewriter and begin to compose one of 2 suicide notes. The following is an excerpt from one of those notes.
I do not really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I cannot recall when it started. I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. After one session, I never saw the doctor again, and since then, I've been fighting my mental turmoil alone, and seemingly to no avail. After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorders.
Whitman sought help, but he was let down. Unfortunately, mental health had not come far enough for the doctor to notice what today would have been obvious. Whitman was in mental distress and needed professional help. Just after midnight, but before finishing his last testament, he drove to his mother's apartment. Not much is known about their interaction. What we do know is, while his mother lay unconscious, Whitman plunged a hunting knife into her heart. According to some reports, he also shot her once. Once the act was done, Whitman placed his mother back into her bed and covered her with a sheet. Next to her body, he left a note.
To whom it may concern, I have just taken my mother's life. I am very upset over having done it. However, I feel that if there is a heaven, she is definitely there now. I am truly sorry. Let there be no doubt in your mind that I love this woman with all my heart.
2 witnesses would pass by the apartment door sometime after the murder. They would later say they heard crying sounds coming from the other side of the door. They said it sounded like a child. Those cries are now thought to be those of Whitman. Tears of remorse, grief, or horror for what he had done, perhaps. But the killer impulse in him would not be deterred by grief. Whitman would continue on with his plan. He would return home at 3 a.m. There, he would stab his wife in the chest 5 times as she slept. He then would cover her with a sheet before returning to the letter that he had started the night before.
I imagine, it appears, that I brutally killed both of my loved ones. I was only trying to do a quick and thorough job. If my life insurance policy is valid, please pay off my debts. Donate the rest anonymously to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type.
This portion of the letter was done in his own handwriting. That fateful morning, Charles Whitman would visit 3 stores where he would add to his arsenal of weapons. He would return home one last time to pack the equipment he thought he would need to carry out his plan. Into an old Marine's footlocker, Whitman would pack food, water, a radio, his M1 carbine, a semi-automatic 12-gauge shotgun, a hunting rifle, several handguns, and other survival items. After he was done packing, Whitman drove to the campus and accessed the main building using an old school ID. He used a dolly he rented to move his supplies. While waiting on the elevator, he was told by a female employee it would only take him to the 27th floor. His response, "You don't know how happy that makes me." He took the elevator up to the 27th floor, then carried his gear up 3 more flights of stairs. On the 28th floor, he would encounter receptionist Edna Townsley. He would strike her in the head with one of his rifles, rendering her unconscious. Miss Townsley would later succumb to her injuries at the hospital. On the 30th floor, a family would stagger upon Whitman as he was setting up his sniper's nest. Whitman turned the shotgun on them and began to fire. Margaret Lamport and Mark Jabor would be killed. Michael and Mary Jabor would suffer injuries but survive. MJ Jabor and William Lamport would escape without injuries. At 11:48 a.m., Whitman would take aim from his vantage point in the clock tower and began firing on bystanders at random. In a panic, the people below scrambled to take cover. Officers Billy Speed and Terry Cope were among the first to respond. The officers took cover behind a statue immediately after exiting their vehicle. Whitman managed to place a shot between a 6-inch gap in the statue, hitting Speed in his abdomen. Chaos ensued below. Police and armed citizens alike fired wildly at the clock tower. Whitman continued to drop his targets with military efficiency. One of his targets, 18-year-old pregnant student Claire Wilson. Miss Wilson was shot in her hip. As she lay bleeding on the ground, she saw her boyfriend, Thomas Ekman, fall beside her. Miss Wilson would lay on the scorching sidewalk for about an hour on a day where temperatures reached over 100 degrees. Claire would survive. She would spend 3 months in a hospital, but unfortunately, her boyfriend and her unborn child would not make it. Hot lead would rain down on the campus of UT for just over 90 minutes, killing and injuring many. By chance, 4 men, 3 police officers, and a bookstore manager would come together to stop Whitman's rampage. The 4 men would make it to the observation deck and formulate a vague plan to stop Whitman. The 4 men broke through Whitman's barricade, and Officer McCoy and Martinez entered the observation deck. This is yet another part of this tragic tale that we are unsure of. Both officers, McCoy and Officer Martinez, claim credit for killing Whitman. What we do know is McCoy fired 2 rounds from his shotgun, and Martinez fired all 6 shots from his .38. Martinez then took the shotgun from McCoy and approached the already downed Whitman. Martinez fired one more time into Whitman's limp body. The following first-hand account comes from one of the men responsible for stopping Whitman.
They made contact with him first, and I thought I heard him running southwards on the west walk, so I fired one shot down the walkway into the wall to try to stop him there. And again, it sounded as if he had reversed his direction and ran back to the northwest corner where he ran into the other officers from the northwest corner, excuse me. And they were in the northeast corner, and the firefight resumed, and they terminated it right there.
Whitman had requested two things for after his death. One, an autopsy be performed on his body, and two, he was cremated after the autopsy. Whitman would not be cremated. Instead, he would be buried in a plot next to his mother. However, his first request was granted. An autopsy was performed. During the autopsy, doctors found a walnut-sized tumor in Whitman's brain. It is still debated today if that tumor had anything to do with Whitman's actions on that August morning. Maybe if Whitman's claims would have been taken more seriously, the tumor would have been found earlier, and the events of that morning wouldn't have happened. In the end, Whitman would have killed 15 people, including his own mother and wife, and injured another 31. It is likely that we will never understand what mental hell Whitman was dealing with, or if the tumor was solely to blame for his actions on that morning.
Dedicated to those who lost their lives on that August morning, and those who live every day with the mental and physical scars that remind them.
Before Uvalde, before Parkland, there was chaos at Columbine.